So unwrapping an object more complex than a cube takes a little thinking. This is another one of these skills where if you are good at spatial relations, it might be a little easier for you, but pretty much everybody can get better at this if you just practice. And there's also a couple other techniques to help you get better at unwrapping complex objects. The other thing is that sometimes you actually need to unwrap objects into multiple forms. So go ahead and add Suzanne to your stage. And let's go ahead and get into the practice of making a new texture object. So let's call this Suzanne. And we'll make this white and then say OK. So right now, if I just selected Suzanne as she is and hit U to unwrap it, just to see what would happen, I'd get this sort of crazy mess. So notice her eyes are actually separate objects, which is why they're positioned in a separate spot. And then her face is kind of unwrapping. We can kind of see what's going on here. It's just everything's really sort of strange. So the rule of thumb is if an area is going to have a lot of detail, like the front of her face, you want that to have more pixel space on the UV map. Whereas something like the underside of her head or the back of her ears, which we're probably not going to look at as much, that can take up smaller space on here. So you're thinking about relative importance of an area. Now, Suzanne's a little weird because of these eyes, because they're separate objects. So let's go ahead and select them and delete them just to simplify this form a little bit. So I'll select this one eye. I hit a vertex in the eye. I'll hit L to select it, and then X to delete those vertices. And then I'll do the same thing with this one, and then L to select all of them, and then X to delete those vertices. All right, so now she's a little bit of a simpler form. She's one manifold form. Again, if I select everything and then hit U to unwrap it, I get pretty much the same thing. So what I want to do is think about where I'm going to put the seams to maximize the amount of space of her head. So I'm going to go to Edge Mode, and I'm just going to start by unwrapping sort of down the back of her head. So when you place seams on an object, the seams, as we saw when we were trying to make our angry cubes, are very visible. And the clone stamp can help hide seams to some extent, but you really don't want to have seams running right down the middle of the face because they're really, really hard to hide. So whatever we can do to keep any seams off the front of her face, that will be our goal. So I'm actually starting the seam a little bit further down on her brow, just to see if I can get away with it. And I'm going down the back of her head and right up to the bottom of her chin. And so I'll hit Control E to mark that seam. And then I'll try unwrapping it again. So A to select everything, U to unwrap. Now already this is much better. You can see I have a lot more room for her face. Her ears, the insides of her ears are still pretty small. That's actually what those points are. And her mouth is a little small and her eyes are a little small. The back of her head is a little big, but this is already much, much better. So I can try then to think about, well, how else can I unwrap this? So in this case, I'm going to see if I can sneak basically around this perimeter of her head and try to flay this out a little bit more. I know that sounds gross, but that's basically what we're doing. So I'm going to mark some seams around here, and then Control E, mark seam. Again, select everything and U and unwrap and see how that changes things. All right, so we've already got a lot more room for her face and much less sort of pixel real estate taken up with those ears. Now that, or the back of the head. Now the challenge is I actually want to be able to see the inside of those ears pretty well. So what I'm going to try to do is go through behind the ears and then run a seam along this edge to try to unwrap that ear. So I'll do Control E and mark seam. Now when you first start unwrapping things, you won't think about things like this necessarily. It's just one of those skills, the more you do it, the better you'll get at it, and the more you'll start thinking about, okay, where do I put seams so that we won't really see it most of the time, but that'll help unwrap our form the best. So then Control E, mark seam, and you'll notice that I'm also trying to make them symmetrical around the form. So then I'll select everything, U to unwrap, and we're getting somewhere. This is looking pretty good. So the fronts of her ears are still a little tight. So I think what I'm going to try to do is run another seam down this back edge here. So this is the problem with this is that this would actually cut this off as a separate form. So this would be separate from the rest of this. So Control E and mark seam. And normally you don't want to do that because it's called making an island. So I'm going to go ahead and Control E, mark seam, and then I'm just going to clear these two seams so that they're attached to the whole head. So Control E, mark seam, or sorry, Control E, clear seam. And then I'll unwrap it again. It made a very little bit of a difference, not a huge difference, but I'm starting to notice some problems with those ears. So I might decide I do want to cut them off. So the problem I'm seeing is that these vertices are overlapping. So anywhere you have vertices that overlap with other vertices, there I just hid that so you could see what's going on over there, they're going to share the same texture. So if I have two eyeballs, let's say, if they're sitting right on top of each other, that's probably okay. They'll be exactly the same texture then. But most of the time when you're texture painting, even with things like eyes, there are going to be slight asymmetries between them. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go ahead and cut off the back of those ears, Control E, mark seam, and then with the front of these ears, I'm actually going to nuance this a little bit. Control E, clear seam, and I think I'm just going to leave it like that. So try to get rid of that one seam right there. Control E, clear seam. And I'm trying to imagine how this is going to wrap. So that's going to cut off, and then this will be pretty flat, pretty much. That might work. I might decide that I do have to go back and add another seam right there. I kind of don't want to because it's right almost in the middle of the face, but it might make the unwrapping a little bit easier. So I'll have to decide about that. But now what I'm going to do is select everything, unwrap it again, and you'll see that the backs of those ears are now two separate islands. Now, all your navigational tools are the same in the UV image editor as they are here. So I have a vertex selected right there. If I hit L, I can grab this guy and just move him over. And same thing with this, I can select a vertex, L, and move it over. And now I have a pretty good amount of real estate in here. So I'm going to go ahead and select this whole form. And it's just plopping it in to sort of fit it in the space. But if I rotate this, you know, if symmetry isn't really that important to me in terms of it being like straight up and down, I can make this even bigger to try to get as much of this in that picture plane as possible. There we go. It's pretty good. Okay. So now this is taking up a lot more space. These little islands over here aren't really ideal. Normally you'd want to pack islands. And actually what I can do is I can select all those and go to UVs and say pack islands, and it'll try to, you know, make them as squished in there as possible. But this is okay for now because we're not designing this for a game. Now the other thing I want to think about is how to make this face area even larger relative to the rest of this. So I could keep adding seams and then scaling things to make the head smaller than the rest of the face. But I think in this case what I'm going to do is actually grab a vertex right in between the eyes, and then I'll hit S for scale. Whoops, I forgot I can use proportional editing in here. So just like in 3D modeling, if I go to this radial button, I can say proportional editing connected. I'll hit S for scale, and my brush is pretty big, so I might need to like squish it down a little bit, but I can make this quite a bit bigger relative to the size of the head. Now if I do that to the eyes, I probably want to do it to the mouth too, so I'll do the same thing, scaling it. I might make this a little smaller because I do want a good amount of detail in the mouth. You might have to do this in phases. So now I'll grab both these guys, and then I'll scale this whole area. Let me make that a little bigger. There we go. So now I have a good amount of detail in the nose and the mouth. Actually, and I will scale the eyes a little bit more too. So I'll just grab this vertex right here, and this vertex right there, and I'll scale those eyes. Again, I can make this a little bigger if I need to. There's something like that. Good. All right, so now the face is relatively large compared to the back of the head. I have the backs of the ears cut off, and I can use this to generate that UV image. So now I can, actually I already have an image there, so I can go ahead and pull that up. There's my UV, and then I could start texture painting this. So this is just one way to unwrap a UV image. Now there's a couple other ways we can do this, and after spending all that time making this look really nice, this is going to make you a little crazy, but if I go to my front view and make sure it's set to orthographic, I can select this and hit U, and there's a couple of different methods for doing that UV unwrapping. So I could say project from view, and it'll give me a straight-on view of that form. Or if I want to be really tricky about this, I could go to top view, Z mode. I'm going to make sure that I have vertices selected and not edges. I'm going to just circle select the whole face. Then I'll go, actually, I'm going to get out of Z mode. We'll just do it this way. It's a little hard to grab all the vertices you want sometimes, but I'll just go ahead and grab this whole front part of the face. You can see as I'm selecting them here, they're showing up over there. And then I'll control click or option click to get rid of those. Okay, so that's my one vertex. So I'm just going to unwrap this selected area. So I will do project from view, just this one part. And then I'm going to just move these guys over where I want them. Now, normally I would want the seams to mark that particular point, but I could do it this way. And then with the ears, I'll go back to my front view, I'll go to Z, I'll circle select the whole ear. So this is going to look kind of weird, but we'll just work with this. Again, normally if you want to work this way, you want to be really precise. And then I will unwrap those. So I'm not going to project from view, I'm going to unwrap. And these guys are all really big, so I'll scale them down in here. Just move them over. So there's that. And now if I select everything, you can see I have her face over here. I have her ears as two separate objects over there. And then this whole rest of this is basically the back of her eyebrows and her head. So if I grab this and hit L, I can actually move this over, scale it down. I can make her face really big. So I'm grabbing a vertex and hitting L. So even though this is one unified mesh, and I have some seams, and those seams are affecting the backs of the ears, I'm basically grabbing one part at a time and then unwrapping that part. So this really is sort of the best method if you have a really complicated form, because then you can control it in terms of areas. You can decide, okay, the face really needs to be one form, this side of the head can be another, this side of the head can be another. As long as you have all the faces selected at some point in this unwrapping, they'll all get a texture. So those are a couple different ways to unwrap complex objects.